some people who couldn't make it. So here we are, we're on record. So uh, today's session is an expanded, I would say much expanded version of some of what I presented on Shabbat. Um, there was I've never seen such a warm reaction to a subject, and the subject really was the Jewish Brigade, or for some you might know that as the Zion Mule Corps. But we'll get into all of that um, as we progress. So let me share my screen, um, and here we go. All right. Hopefully everyone's seeing one slide, not two. Is that correct?
Yes, that's
Okay, good. All right. So the Jewish brigades of His Majesty's Armed Forces. So that's the subject. The truth of the matter is, when I made the first slide, I wanted to discuss both the Jewish brigades of His Majesty's Armed Forces, those that served in World War I, and also the ones that served in World War II. However, there's just too much information to fit all of that into one session. And there is a fantastic movie. It made me cry, about the Jewish Brigade of the Second World War. Really fascinating story that does not really end with the end of the war. It's a really, really riveting story, but it deserves its own treatment. It cannot happen in one. So we're going to discuss the Jewish brigades of His Majesty's Armed Forces. So before we even get into the question of the Jewish brigades, we need to sort of understand that there is a unique scenario that's taking place. And the scenario that's taking place starts, I would say, in 1796. Modern Judaism really starts then with the French Revolution. The very last act of the French Continental Congress is to grant citizenship to the Jews. And in Western Europe, the Jews become citizens. Oh wow, there's already a comment. I'll get you the name of the movie. By the end, I will show you the YouTube. It's available, and you'll be able to get the link. I'll paste it in at the very end. Okay. So the story is that Jews are becoming citizens of their various countries. And part of what happens is Jews are trying to present their bona fides in all of those different places. And Jews at the same time are starting to have real visions of nationalism, right? You have Theodor Herzl, who died shortly before all of this takes place, and he has this World Zionist Congress. And the World Zionist Congress really represents something which is torn between these two polarities. On the one hand, you have the polarity of Kaiser Wilhelm and the Central Powers, and then you have this additional polarity of the Allies. And Jews in each one of these countries are going to feel a real patriotism. And as we're going to see as we progress through this, that Jews are going to be very passionate about each of these sides. And this is not at all like World War II. In World War II, Jews were entirely aligned with one side, with good reason. But we see, though, that World War I was a very different story. And World War I is an era of rampant nationalism, and Jews are trying to conquer the problem of anti-Semitism. And part of the way that they're trying to conquer the problem of anti-Semitism is to show that they are full-fledged citizens of each of these nations. And the World Zionist Congress is going to be so conflicted that it's going to have to relocate to Denmark, which is officially neutral. It will also, at one point, relocate to New York, which is also neutral in this conflict. I think also it should be said that World War I was the most illogical of all wars. Scholars have struggled mightily to try and figure out what was the real cause of World War One? Was it the inherent belligerence of nations? Was it Germany's fantasy with the Übermensch and its philosophers and the greatness of Germany and the need for Germany to dominate? There's also a real question about the all these entangled alliances that people could hardly understand and that were negotiated, and did people really have to go in for various reasons, or should I say, did nations need to be entangled for various reasons? They're absolutely Byzantine in terms of their complexity, and Jews get thrust into this war. In the midst of this whole conflict is a power that we typically don't think terribly much about in the context of World War One, but we think about a lot in the context of Israel, and that is the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire wanted its Jews to become citizens of the Ottoman Empire and also enlist in her armies. And many Jews refused to do that. They did not want, they were living in the land of Israel at the time, and they did not want to participate in the armies under an Ottoman flag. And so they ended up, because they wouldn't take citizenship in the Ottoman Empire, they were exiled. And they were exiled to Egypt. And there was actually a refugee camp in a place called Alexandria. And there were two very famous Jews that served in that particular area. Those two Jews were Ze'ev Jabotinsky and Yosef Trumpeldor. I just as a matter of full disclosure, I remember that Yosef Trumpeldor was a go-to Purim costume when you were very young, because as Yosef Trumpeldor lost his arm, and you could just tuck your arm in and let one sleeve down. You get a little military cap, you get a pretend gun, and before you knew it, you were Yosef Trumpeldor. And so he sort of always existed in this early Zionist lore. But these are two very different people. Ze'ev Jabotinsky is really a journalist who ends up in Alexandria, and Trumpeldor is a decorated officer of the Russian army. And so he is the only Jew who was ever promoted to officer rank in the Russian army. He gave service in the Russo-Japanese War. He was awarded with the St. George Order, the highest Russian military award you could get for bravery. He spent a year as a prisoner of war after the surrender of Port Arthur. And he even met the Tsarina. He had real military credentials. And the two of them end up in this camp in Alexandria, and the two of them realize that it is important, as they're conceiving of this Jewish homeland, and they know that Jews are going to have to fight for it, for Jews to get military training. And in order for Jews to get military training, they should participate with one of the great powers. And the one that is most available to them is the United Kingdom, is Britain. And they petition to be given the ability to organize a Jewish corps under the British. Just checking the chat here. So these two petition, and they're rejected. They are not going to be given the ability to organize a combat unit amongst the Jews. The British are just wary of the fact that this could be a very politically dangerous thing for them. When they take back Palestine, they understand what the politics there are, and arming Jews is a very dangerous thing. But they are given a special commission to be able to select a body of 500 soldiers, which are going to be a mule transport company. And the British are absolutely desperate for these kind of things. I think, though, we sit in a very interesting moment, because we've become very appreciative of the supply lines in military context based on the war in Ukraine between the Russians and the Ukrainians, and the failure to get things like ammunition, socks, and fuel to the front lines, and all of these logistic questions are very important. Well, before you had, military convoys, you had mule support. And that is what this particular brigade did. Now, Jabotinsky was offended that the British were not going to let them fight, and so he initially refused. And he said, I have enough with you. Well, I'll go do something else. Trumpeldor, who was a soldier, said, okay. Jabotinsky, the journalist, right? He wants headline materials, and mule corps are not headline materials. Trumpeldor knows what you need is combat action, right? Even your mule support is ultimately going to get they're going to get weapons, and they're going to get real training. Who was the leader of this brigade? So the British found this very interesting individual, Colonel J.H. Patterson, who had been commissioned to select a body of 500 with 750 transport mules. Orders were given partly in Hebrew and partly in English, and the men were armed with rifles taken from the Turks during the Battle of the Suez Canal. Probably this was the first purely Jewish fighting corps that went into action since Jerusalem fell to the Roman armies under Titus in AD 70. So that's really a fascinating piece. And this comes, by the way, from the journal of Brigadier General C.S. Aspinall Oglander, right, in his memoir, Military Operations Gallipoli. So he's telling you this, and he in the moment, he recognizes the significance of this. This is the first time you have the armed, organized Jewish fighters in 2,000 years, right? So this is a big deal. This Colonel J.H. Patterson had actually a very colorful history. In the Boer War, he was caught in the embrace of the wife of his companion, Audley James Blythe, the son of 1st Baron Blythe, and who was the former lieutenant of the very corps they served in, the Essex Yeomanry. And unfortunately, his companion, Audley James Blythe, after catching him in the, passionate embrace of his wife, put his pistol to his temple and killed himself. Now, Patterson had said this was really sunstroke, and that this suicide was fever that he had gotten, but the scandal forced his resignation from the regiment. So he wasn't exactly a top shelf pick for this particular group of soldiers, but nevertheless, he made it work. And just to show you the sort of how auspicious this moment was, the Grand Rabbi Raphael de la Pergola, who was the rabbi in Alexandria, Egypt at the time, so he talked about Patterson as the second Moses who would lead the children of Israel from Egypt to the Promised Land. Right? That's a big statement, right? That this guy, who has a bit of a colored past, he calls him the next Moses. They were not originally called the Jewish Brigade. That was seen to be possibly a little bit too forward. They were known as the 38th Battalion of the Royal Fusiliers. And the British had promised the unit badges and an insignia, and regimental colors would identify it as being entirely Jewish. But interestingly, there were anti-Zionist Jews in Britain who led to that particular promise being withheld. And so in the end, they did have shoulder patches that had a menorah and said Kadima, right? And Kadima means going forward. And so they didn't get the full regimental colors. But this was a very interesting group of people, right? You had there of 120 former muleteers, a large contingent of Russian Jews were from London. 150 Jewish Americans joined, and there were an additional Palestinian Jews. At that time, it was called Palestine because that's the name that the British gave it. And 92 Turkish Jews. That's amazing, right? These are Jews who were caught from the Ottoman Turks and were allowed to serve in this corps because their Jewish co-religionists believed that they were trustworthy enough, so they put them into this corps. And there are household names in this group, right? David Ben-Gurion, whose picture you see there on the right, and Levi Eshkol, future Prime Minister of Israel, and the father of Yitzhak Rabin. Now, this group fought in a very important battle. They fought in the Battle of Gallipoli, and they fought valiantly. And this is just sort of where the battle transpired, and this is where the troops saw its action. And this is significant. This is the first group of Jews who had military training. It was really important. This group goes on to form the Haganah. Jabotinsky is I don't know, he's the first one to have the thought, but he's certainly the one most credited with the thought that Jews with military had to have military experience, because if you don't fight for your homeland, you'll never get it. And that the Jews knew that they were going to need to defend themselves, because the threats of attack on Jewish settlements in what was then called Palestine, which we call Eretz Yisrael, was something that they were certain was going to happen, and they knew they needed to have that kind of training. There is, though, a larger context to this whole question of Jews in war. This is the one group of people who were Jews united under a flag. And just show you one other interesting thing. The way that Jabotinsky joined this particular brigade was Jabotinsky joined the brigade as a recruiter. And there were recruiting offices. There were recruiting offices all over. And the recruiting offices, we had one here in Montreal. And this is the same poster, obviously, one in Yiddish and the other one in English, right? I love this down here. Captain Isidor Friedman. He doesn't get Isidor over here. He's just Captain Friedman. And the address is the same. 786 St. Lawrence Boulevard in Montreal. And you see this, this idea that everyone is expected to do their duty to serve Britain in this epic struggle that is going on. And so I think that's just an interesting touch point for us locally, that was part of the recruiting effort that took place. But there is more to say about what really goes on in this particular time, because this is as I said, this is the one dedicated Jewish fighting force. But as we pointed out at the very beginning, Jews are being caught between two different powers. They're being caught between the powers of the Central Powers and the Allied powers. And Jews are going to fight on both sides. So we're going to look at the Allied side first a little bit, and then we'll go on to look at the Central Powers. And here I was able to find an article about Rabbi Joseph Herman Hertz. He is the chief rabbi of England. He is the rabbi who occupies the same office that Rabbi Sachs, Zichrono Livracha, whose yahrzeit was a couple days ago, also occupied. And the head of the United Synagogues, the chief rabbi of England. For most of us, he's very famous because he produced this Chumash. Maybe you recognize it from the inside. This is the Chumash that I grew up with. My synagogue, Beth Tefillah, had this. I'm almost certain Sharet Tzedek had this. I've sort of, polled other people from English-speaking parts of the world. Stan Karen told me that this is what he has in growing up in South Africa. And Hertz was a very important rabbi who published a lot of things in the English language, and he was quite a scholar as well. But part of his job was to represent as sort of a unified interest, to represent the interests of the broader community in the United Kingdom at that time. And so this is a published sermon that he gave in August of 1915. And he uses the very, very interesting words. He says, like Abraham of old, British parents have voluntarily obeyed the summons. Take your son, who you love, and give up your dearest for the peace and safety of the realm. Mourning has entered the homes of tens of thousands, and there is a solemn pride in the great sacrifice they have laid on the altar of their country. So here Hertz is saying, you, by sending your children to the army, you are acting with the same kind of resolute faith that Avram Avinu had. Right? That this is a powerful image. Avram Avinu's pure faith, and the sacrifice is a sacrifice for God. A very powerful image. And I just give you a contrast to that image, which is another use of the Akedah. This one comes from the Midrash Rabbah on Eicha, in the Scroll of Lamentations, and it's in the context of the Hadrianic persecutions. That there's a certain mother, her name is Miriam, and Miriam has 7 sons. Each one is told to bow down to one of the Roman gods, and each one refuses. And even the last one, the emperor throws some coins on the ground, and he says, "Look, you could pretend you're picking up the coins." And the youngest boy says, "I won't do it." And each one of them is executed summarily. And the Midrash says as follows. It says, "Miyad sava alav lahargo." So immediately the emperor commanded that this last child would be killed. Nafla imo alav, and his mother fell upon him. V'haita mechabko, and she was hugging him and kissing him, and she says as follows: "Go tell your father Abraham and tell him, this is what my mother said. Do not glorify yourself because you built, I should say, an altar, and you placed your son thereupon. My mother built 7 altars, and placed 7 sons thereupon in one day. Yours was a test, mine was real." So here she's saying, what I gave myself for pure faith. I and my sons, we would not betray the faith in God. We would not worship idols. That is how Avraham has been classically used. In the Crusades, again, Avraham is used in the same way. Here, Rabbi Hertz is using the image of Avraham to advance a nationalistic goal. Now, I'm not criticizing the fact that he did this. We'll scratch a little deeper and we'll see why this was so important for him to say this. But it's a rather startling move for someone to say that defense of country is on the level of faith of Avraham. That said, looking at another incident that took place with Rabbi Hertz, there was an argument that took place with the Beit Din of Leeds. The Beit Din of Leeds wanted to give exemption to 3 young men who were Kohanim. And all of the young men were conscripted. There was exemption for religious professionals, practitioners. And Rabbi Hertz was trying to set a very strict standard so that it would not appear that the Jewish community was, if you will, draft dodging, that they were being good and patriotic Britons. Because there was a sense that Jews did not fully participate. And the Jews in England were aware there was a special census that took place in the Axis powers that was actually more profoundly used in the lead up to World War II, where the suggestion was given that Jews did not serve in the Kaiser's army and the way they should have. But the smell was in the air, right? This idea that Jews are not really, they don't really have allegiance to His Majesty's army. The Jews are out for themselves. And so Rabbi Hertz is trying to defend this idea. And so the Beit Din in Leeds, they're just trying to get as many exemptions as they can. So there are 3 men who are Kohanim, and they say, look, first of all, we cannot become defiled to a dead body. That's against the law of being a Kohen. That's problem number 1. Problem number 2 is that a Kohen who kills another person can no longer return to Duchan, can no longer return to give the priestly blessing. And they wanted to use that as the basis for their exemption. Rabbi Hertz said, no deal. And he wouldn't certify that exemption. The matter almost came to the courts. I guess they came to some resolution. It's not clear how the article that references this says that he could not see any clear resolution to this issue. All the documentation was in the build-up to that. So perhaps they found some other resolution. Maybe they got them jobs as quartermasters or jobniks, as they're called in Israel. That's not clear. But what you can tell for sure is that Rabbi Hertz wanted to ensure that the Jews were being very patriotic, and this is a very important question to this whole. There's this whole picture, and the question of loyalty, and so we're going to see exactly how Rabbi Hertz deals with this in a sermon. Okay, this is his Yom Kippur sermon. To every son and daughter of Israel, the Day of Atonement addresses the question: are you living your life worthily, true to your God and true to your people? Or will, through you, the Jewish cause be dishonored and the divine name desecrated? In accents that cannot be drowned to these words reverberate in our ears today. When the Jewish community is confronted with a serious problem of present-day duty, that means military service, we rejoice to think that the hosts of our brethren are gladly offering their lives for right, capital R. That the number of those in England alone who have responded to the call of their country is nearly 25,000. But we grieve to think of the few thousands among the hundreds of thousands constituting the Jewish citizenship of the Allied nations who desire to be exempted from the fulfillment of their elementary duty of patriotism. We lament this fact and consider it a great danger threatening the fair name of Israel. Meaning, if you don't serve, people aren't saying you're a schnook, they're saying the Jews are schnooks. It's a chil Hashem. And every little wet straw can produce enough smoke to hide the stars, right? What a great analogy, right? There are a couple of wet stalks here, but they obscure the great work that the rest of the Jews are doing. And remembering the injustice with which the world so often judges Israel, we have, alas, good reason to fear that the sacrifices, nay, the martyrdom of the 500,000 of our brethren fighting in Russia and the scores of thousands in other belligerent countries will count as naught because of 2,000 or 3,000 Jews who are laggards. Right? So he gives this big, fiery sermon on Yom Kippur about what's the sin you need to repent for? Not signing up for the army. This is not a new thing for great rabbis in leadership positions who need to advance the cause du jour of their host countries. Just to give you another example, the Noda B'Yehuda, Rabbi Yechezkel Landau, maybe one of the most celebrated poskim rabbis, he gives a glowing eulogy for Maria Theresa, the Empress of Austria. And this is the woman who, decades earlier, had tried to get all of the Jews expelled from Prague. But when she dies, he's got to give like this great grand sermon, telling everybody how wonderful she was and how devout she was and how chaste she was. And it's clear the Noda B'Yehuda knew what he's doing. Jews live by the grace of their monarchs. Rabbi Shlomo Ibn Virga in his Noda B'Yehuda, in his Shevet Yehuda, does the same thing, and he lauds King Manuel of Portugal, who forcibly converted the Jews, because he knows if you don't stroke the backs of the monarch, you can get in big trouble. So here, Rabbi Hertz is negotiating perhaps a slightly different line, because he's saying the Jewish question in England, the fate of our ability to have a community here rests on us being good citizenships. And this is interesting. This scholar, Derek Penslar, who wrote a book, Jews in the Military, has an interesting analysis of what goes on. He says Jews are, in this particular time, they are fulfilling what they believe is a valid contract with modernity. And that is, if we are good citizens, our countries will be good to us. And you will see, especially as we flip now to the German side, that household Jewish names, not all Orthodox, certainly not all Orthodox, but household Jewish names, philosophers, are going to say things that in retrospect seem absolutely mad. But if you say this was the contract they had with modernity, this is the contract they had as good as citizens of their country, Maybe it makes a little more sense. So let's start with Franz Rosenzweig. He's a famous Reform Jew who actually converts to Judaism, writes this book called Star of Redemption. And so while he's serving on the Macedonian front, he penned a couple essays celebrating Germany's geopolitical mission to create a vast, I don't even know what that German word is, but it looks like a metropolitan empire, right? From Antwerp over Strasbourg towards Trieste, Salonika, Cyprus, and Suez, right? And he's like, he can dream the dream of the Kaiser and put it on paper. Martin Buber, right, the famed Jewish scholar, accused Belgian women of defiling German corpses and claimed that the war would unite Germans and Jews in their great mission to civilize the Middle East. And then he quotes Dante, incipit vida nuova. It begins a new life, right? So, again, they're seized with this vision of German civilized life taking over the rest of the world. Hermann Cohen is a neo-Kantian philosopher. Now, you know anything about Kantians, they're all about the moral imperative, right? So here's somebody obsessed with the moral imperative. Rabbi Soloveitchik writes his thesis on Hermann Cohen and Maimonides, right? This is no sort of backwater mind. And he tries to persuade the U.S. government to enter the war on Germany's side. So this is you see that German Jews are patriotic and they are invested in the war. There is sort of one, just catching up the chat. Is that what it means, Marcus? Central European Empire. Okay. Thank you, Marcus. Going back a slide or two. Yes, I guess the I see. Middle European Empire. Okay. All right. Excellent. Thank you for that. I like when it gets crowdsourced. Okay. There is sort of a third group here because the Russians they are part of the Allies, but certainly culturally they're going to be very different than France, Belgium, and the United Kingdom. And there were 30,000 young Russian Jews in the United Kingdom. And it's so interesting. These Jews refused to fight on behalf of the oppressive Tsar and kill fellow Jews who were part of the Triple Alliance. Just fascinating that the Russian Jews in England did not want to be at all part of a killing machine. I guess they had already understood how corrupt the military is and the Tsar was, and they were like, yeah, I get it. This war really started for Russia's benefit. Even though the Germans sort of advanced towards Luxembourg before they may even have traded shots with the Russians, but they sort of understood implicitly, and it was a big problem actually in England. Rabbi Hertz references this because the Russian Jews weren't trusted enough to go into the British ranks, so the only people sort of between the ages of 20 and 30 on the streets of places like Leeds were Russian Jews. It was not a good look for England or for Jews. In France, you had the opposite thing. These immigrants from Russia were more willing to serve. Again, this the scholar who wrote this book, Derek Pencillard, Jews and War. He says, I'm not sure, just a little bit about his methodology. He goes and reads war diaries and letters from soldiers. He's very interested in the social history, really what did the rank and file believe. And we're going to see a little bit more of that as we dig deeper into this subject. But he thinks that the Russian Jews that ended up serving in the French army were very taken with the idea that that France is the birthplace of revolution, and maybe they thought something different was going to happen. And here's an interesting, perspective of a Central European Jew, essentially a Lithuanian Jew. At this point, that's more or less going to be aligned with Russia, at least geographically. That's where they would be conscripted. And this is the Yad Aaron of Aaron Shmuel Samaris. I had never heard of him until I saw him quoted in this context. But you can see that he has a book, Chidushei Torah. This is a a classic rabbinic text. He was a student of the Volozhin Yeshiva. He's like one of those perhaps not a headline, but he's a classic Lithuanian Torah scholar. And this is what he writes. He writes, "How terrible is it that corruption which would result from any evil example set by Jacob, selected by God, Israel, his special treasure, were he also to adopt the faith of Esav." The blessing that is given to Esav is al charbecha tichye, you're going to live by the sword. And he says that's not the Jewish way, right? Hakol kol Yaakov hayadayim yedei Esav. The voice is the voice of Jacob. Jacob's voice is for peace. The hands, those belong to Esav. Those go to war. And so he says Jews should stay out of the army as much as they can. But Jews did not stay out of the army. There were 450,000 Jews in the Central Powers army. There were over 1 million Jews in the Allied forces. 5% of the Russian military was Jewish, and 4% of Austria-Hungary's military was Jewish. Which leads us, with these kind of overwhelming numbers, the idea that a Jew killed another Jew was a real, if not a definite possibility. And so, as I quoted on Shabbos, there's this story that goes around that there are two Jews, and one kills the other with a bayonet, and as he dies, his last gasping breaths are Shema Yisrael, and one of them, and the victorious soldier goes mad from the experience. The original source of this, at least according to Pencillar, is the Yiddish writer S. Ansky, and he would deliver relief going from place to place in the Pale of Settlement, and he compiled a number of stories. So in St. Petersburg, he heard of a Jew who had bayoneted another soldier, who just before expiring gasped and articulated the Shema. His killer, so the story went mad. But he was never able to document exactly which soldier it was. The kinds of exacting details don't exist for that story. He has also other stories which are similar. In Kiev, he heard about a Jew who killed another, and upon death, he produced a pouch of money and gave it to his killer so that the killer could give it to his widowed wife and orphaned children. But there were also stories that went the other way. There was a military hospital in Moscow, and a soldier avowed that he had killed another Jew. But before he could do so, he withdrew his bayonet at the last second, and instead he took the Jew as a prisoner. But a couple weeks later, the S. Ansky ran into the same soldier, and now he changed his story. He's saying, no, he actually killed the other man. And he went through his belongings, and he found his tefillin bag, right? So Ansky is not a dumb guy, and he says, this guy is like telling unconscious lies. And why is he telling all these stories? Because he's sort of verbalizing the emotional anguish about fighting in general and the prospect of killing, a fellow Jew. That's a very big deal. And he thinks that all of these stories are apocryphal, and that really, though, they are the ways that people are, in a literary sense or a story sense, dealing with the anxiety of the fact that maybe this isn't really our war, right? Why is it that Jews would be killing Jews? And you have Jews lobbying the U.S. government to get in on opposite sides of the war. This is, again, that wager that people make with modernity, is that I need to be a good citizen of my country so that my country treats me well. And in hindsight, that's a horrible equation, right? Especially on the German side, right? The Germans do not deserve that. They violate that contract more miserably than any society ever. But there was this moment where Jews were seized with this idea, finally we have citizenship, we're going to be taken seriously, it's going to be the end of anti-Semitism. It doesn't happen at all that way. There is one actually documented story, and this is what's so powerful about this book, right? Jews in the military, Derek Penslar, is what he does is he actually goes and reads through all of this, personal material. He's interested not just what's printed in the papers, he's interested in what is written in the diaries of these soldiers. And this is what he writes. He finds from Sergeant Major V. Rathbone of the King Edward's Horses. He writes this in a letter to his brother. I was up and down the trenches for 24 hours, with 1 hour's rest. We captured a German officer, Lieutenant Max Seller, of a Bavarian cavalry regiment. He and about 50 men were attacking us with hand bombs, and the officer was bayoneted on the parapet. I helped to bury him with our own casualties. He was a Jew, so I had the services altered by the chaplain. Possibly his people might be glad to know, and if you asked the Jewish Chronicle and the Jewish world to mention it, they might learn of it. He was a plucky chap, and our fellows could not help expressing admiration at his effort to bomb us. So, this is the enemy. I'm treating him as the enemy. We bayoneted him, but he was a Yid, so I buried him and I made sure that the chaplain said Kaddish. Right? So you see that Jews from each side, I titled this, to me this is that, that when you were in B'nai Akiva or maybe NCSY or some youth group, they always ask you, are you a Canadian Jew or are you a Jewish Canadian, right? So I write this as Jewish Englishman or English Jew, right? Because what would you do in this situation, right? You're squaring off, and are you an Englishman at that moment or are you a Jew? If you're an Englishman, you drive the bayonet. If you're a Yid, you don't. And, maybe he didn't know until after the fact that he was a Jew. But you can see that it's not like he's not going mad after knowing he's Jewish. He's like, I did my job and I made sure he also got a kosher kvura, right? So this is perhaps, this is the opposite of Ansky's stories. Ansky's stories are about the anguish that the two sides had against each other. And this is really a little bit more about the fact that when it came down to it, British Jews were British, and this was war. And maybe when you've buried half your company, or when you've experienced lots of casualties, or people throw bombs at you, you tend to think of them a little differently. Just a couple of interesting notes just around the... apparently in the German army, tefillin were quite popular, and there was even a belief, not brief, that they could stop bullets and protect the wearer from harm. So there were very devout Jews in the ranks of these armies. Interestingly, Ralph Rothstein told me that his father was a quartermaster in the Austrian army. Okay, and then finally, maybe one of the most interesting slides. So here we see pictures of Jews in both armies. So these are, on the right, are Jewish Hungarian soldiers who are fighting alongside the Ottoman Turks. They have been sent there to help the Ottoman Turks defend Israel. And they come to the Western Wall and they daven that their side will win. Now, these two pictures are not taken at the same time. The picture on the left is the Royal Jewish Brigades. This is the Zion Mule Corps, obviously without their donkeys, and the Zion Mule Corps was there a little bit later, but they too were praying at the Western Wall that they would defeat their enemies, in Gallipoli as they were en route to there. This was around Pesach of, I think, maybe Pesach 1918. Not 100% sure. I should have recorded that date. But there's a story here which is quite interesting. There's an individual named Chaim Berzin who was a Ukrainian Jewish immigrant to the U.S. and he enrolls in the 39th Fusiliers, and in his memoirs, which he writes, that of an encounter with German and Turkish prisoners of war. one of whom turned out to be his next-door neighbor from childhood. And he saw his voice, and he screamed out at the top of my lungs, Machitzion, Machitzion! A Turkish officer! Just a day ago, my enemy. I shot at him. Perhaps he shot at me. And now we are friends again. Oh, great God, the Jewish people, what accursed people. And Malchitzion had claimed that that he served in the service of the Sultan, and he took 3 Jewish prisoners from the 38th Battalion of Royal Fusiliers, and both Chaim Berzin and his boyhood friend Malchitzion went and served out of their sense of obligation to their countries for patriotism. But as soon as the war ended, they were friends again. This particular moment, it's a very odd moment where we see how Jews are caught up in the violence that is the madness of the world. Jews are trying to be good citizens. They're trying to be patriots. But they recognize on one way or another the absolute madness of Jews shooting at other Jews, Jews firing at other Jews, Jews engaged in armed conflict with other Jews. And, as I mentioned on Shabbat, it's just a reminder that, Remembrance Day should have a sadness that maybe competes mightily with the patriotism. Is that not all wars are really just, and that, and particularly World War I had its insanity. And there may be parts of that war which were the defense of the innocents, but for any Jew, the political lesson should perhaps be that wars are costly, and they pit brothers against brothers, and this is not how we wish to perhaps gain our legs up in the world. And it draws a particularly stark contrast, a lens that allows us to see the folly and the sadness of this particular epoch of world history and Jewish history. But there's also no question that this sets the stage for the Haganah and the various arms or subgroups of Jewish defense that will ultimately form the IDF. I promised that the last thing I would do is to show you this movie on the Jewish Brigade. So I will do so. So it is this movie, In Our Own Hands, The Hidden Stories of the Jewish Brigade in World War II. And I will put the link in the chat right now. So that's the link to that movie, In Our Own Hands. It's really an amazing movie, and I hope next year, around Remembrance Day, to be able to tell you more about the story of the Jewish Brigade, Chatifa Yehudi Lochemet, right, which means the Jewish Fighting Brigade. And these Jews did fight, and their story is remarkable. And I would say the remarkable part of there's just so much about their story which is remarkable. The story of the Jewish Brigade of the First World War is, yes, they were the first Jews to hold weapons in an organized fashion since the time of I guess Masada. Masada would be the last Jews to have held that until this Jewish Brigade, and they're very important in the sense that they do form the foundation of Israel's defense forces, ultimately. But it also should be pointed out that Jew really did fight Jew in this war, and that lots of Jewish leaders got caught up in the nationalism and patriotism of the moment, which probably led to Jews regrettably killing other Jews. Anyway, that's the presentation. Questions, comments, thoughts, additional information, people who know more about this than I do. Okay. That's it, huh? I left them in silence.
We say thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
It's Lynn. Are you going to be talking about Jews in the Second World War as well?
So here's what I'm thinking. So, okay, this is where we've been in this class. We've been doing the history of Jerusalem. And really, my next scheduled lecture in sort of the history of Jerusalem was Nachmanides, and his personality and who he was, and his ultimate aliyah, his emigration to the land of Israel. And then probably I was going to go a little bit more into some of the other medieval history. I'm a little bit tempted right now. I've been doing a little bit of work on the story of the secret Jews of the Marranos, and so I thought maybe I'd do something there. I'm certainly happy to take requests. I don't have to do the history of Jerusalem. The history of Jerusalem gets a little thin between, let's say, 1200 and 1900, because there's just not that. Well, actually, I shouldn't say that. Between 1200 and the expulsion of the Jews from Spain. So probably around 1500 or so, it picks back up with Tzfat and the mystics there. So we could do that. Is one possibility. We could pick up some other theme. We're not wedded to that. But because I had this at the tip of my fingers, and somebody said to me, "Oh, you should really record this because it's such an interesting little slice of Jewish history." So I did that. The other thing I would say is, I'm kind of figuring maybe I should save this for next Remembrance Day, because it's the right topic. But if people say, "Oh no, we want to hear about the other Jewish brigade," so why not? You know, I'm not beyond. I could be convinced on that one. So I don't know. Anybody have any thoughts on what should we do next?
No, just to pick up on a comment you made about Jew fighting Jew, and you made it sound a little bit like sort of fairly ancient history, but is that not likely what's happening between Ukraine and Russia today, when they both have conscripted servicemen and there's reasonable remnants of Jewish populations in both territories?
Yeah, you know, it may be so, and neither one of those are purely volunteer armies, and so that's another factor here. Though I haven't looked. For sure, on the Ukrainian side, there have been rabbis who have been very full-throated about the need to participate and to defend. I can't say I know very much about what the Russian rabbis are saying on that front, but they're very possible. You know, certainly the Greek Orthodox Church or the Russian Orthodox Church has been very solidly in lockstep with the Russian government. I would imagine that the Chabad Lubavitch of Moscow is probably keeping as low a profile as it can, if I were guessing, but I don't know.
I think one of the major rabbis fled and left Russia. Whether that was Moscow.
Yeah, that may be so. Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. Yeah, Dina.
Rabbi, that was a lot of information that you gave tonight. How did that actually pan out for the British and the French, I guess, and all the other countries that were trying to promote Jewish enlistment?
I
Did
think
it make
in
life
Britain,
easier for them on their own home territories?
I think in Britain, it was their service was recognized, and their the I think it worked out it worked out well for the British Jews. I don't know about the French Jews. I didn't really, but the one thing is that ultimately the British government comes back to this model, right, of creating a Jewish regiment, and Winston Churchill is the Lord of the Admiralty during World War One, and then he's the Prime Minister during World War Two, and it is Winston Churchill who actually approves this Jewish fighting brigade, and he says, we should give them the right to fight against these monsters who are fighting them. I'm obviously not being as eloquent as Churchill, but I do believe that the patriotism of the English Jews was not questioned. The patriotism of the German Jews is a fascinating thing. The German Jews, there's this census to see how many Jews really are fighting on the front lines, and what Derek Penslar, he says that what's interesting is the Jews fighting in the trenches don't even mention the census. They're not worried about it. They're dealing with funny things, and the interesting thing is that you see that Jews return to this sense of nostalgia of the war, when men could be men and we could really defend our country, etc., etc. But the Germans will use this census to sort of to suggest that the Jews were really a fifth column, and part of the reason that they lost the war was because of the Jews in their ranks. So it certainly, I mean, no surprise. It doesn't, I don't think I shocked anybody by saying that the Germans used Jewish military service against them, right? That's, I would expect no less from the Nazis. But, it didn't work out so well on either side. In the Russian context, it's even more complicated, because Russia doesn't ever really exist again as a czarist country long after, right? These are Jews who, Trotsky is a Jew, right? And many of the revolutionaries in what's it called? In Russia are Jews. So Jews were associated with the revolution more than perhaps czarist patriotism. Yeah, Marcus.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier the sort of the social contract of being a good citizen and the risks of being perceived as a sort of non-committed citizen.
Right.
I think it's generally accepted that in the UK, in England and Scotland and Wales, sort of participation in both the First and the Second World Wars did a lot for inter-community relations. And I think the non-Jewish population, in many cases, for the first time, they met and socialized with and fought alongside Jewish people who they wouldn't normally have come across if they didn't live, in one of the heavily Jewishly concentrated areas.
Right.
So I think that for sort of decades afterwards, there was a much sort of warmer appreciation of the fact that Jews were normal people, as it were, than might have otherwise have been the case.
I think that I think I read that in Penslar's book, he says something similar in terms of what were, like, if you read some of the Reform Jewish argumentations for being part of the war, that social camaraderie with the non-Jewish population is something that they mentioned even during the war, and I would suspect that that's probably true. Unfortunately, alav shalom, I would have asked Joe Siegel, about was that his experience having served in the Calgary Highlanders, but I have a feeling that was quite true for a lot of Jews who served in the military in various contexts. It was a melting pot. It's a place where you meet other people and they become your lifelong friends and comrades because you rely on them to save your life. And there are probably very few experiences in life that will make you as close to another person as, having them shoot covering fire while you run to the next trench.
Rabbi, I asked about the Second World War because my father served in the South African Army for 5 years in North Africa. Well, for 2 years in North Africa, then he was captured and he was a POW in Europe during the Second World War, fighting for the Allies. And what you just said about, the comradeship of the soldiers was absolutely true in his case. He didn't tell us a lot of stories, but I've done a lot of reading over the years. But he is the one person that he remained friendly with all his life until this person died was a man who saved him by carrying him on his shoulder when he collapsed on the march from the after they were captured. They went through the desert and they were picked up by ships in North Africa, I forget, and then shipped across to Europe. And he carried my father when my father collapsed.
Wow.
And he was not Jewish, but they remained very good friends right through.
Yeah. Wow. There's some very powerful stories like that.
I was interested to know if you were going to talk a little bit about the Second World War, because I haven't actually done a lot of reading about the Jews. I know there were a lot of Jews in the South African army at that time.
Well, the truth of the matter is, this is, I'm swimming in new waters in most of this stuff. But as it's funny because I was just talking to my brother married an Israeli woman, and I was talking to him, and his mother-in-law happened to be there when I was talking to him last night, and her father was in the Jewish brigade of the Second World War, because there were a lot of Israelis. It's going to be hard for me to add much to this movie because this movie really, you get the firsthand testimony of these soldiers. I'm wondering when this came out, but it looks like maybe this is 30, 40 years old, this movie. Anyhow, the hour is late. I appreciate everybody sticking with me. It's a fascinating subject, and one of the things which inspired him to write this book is this: we Jews have a reputation of not fighting, and Jews may be pacifists, but we're not passive, and that we really did serve in a lot of these armies when we had the opportunity, and if we continue on this line, and you can message me independently whether you want to or not, this is the beginning of Jews saying we're going to fight to defend ourselves. So anyhow, thank you all and have a fantastic evening.